What's up guys, I'm BTC. Even with the most recent buffs, new strategies, and a strong bunker comp meta, Bastion is still the least played and least viable character in the entire game. Let's try to fix that. In this video, I'm going to talk about the flaws and other problems that Bastion has, but make no mistake, I don't hate the character, nor am I trying to dunk on anyone that likes to play Bastion. Quite the opposite. I want to make the character better, more viable, but also less frustrating to deal with. Bastion's design makes him particularly difficult to balance for both higher and lower bracket players at the same time. I do have a few solutions for this, but first we need to take a look at what problems the character has and where he is right now. After Overwatch was released, some characters started lagging behind, and as a result, Blizzard gave them reworks. Some were more successful than others, but Bastion hasn't gotten the attention he needs. Yes, he did get the Ironclad passive a while back, and for a very short time, he was unbelievably powerful, but after they corrected that, he just fell back down. For a long time, Bastion has been sitting at a pick rate of less than 1%, pretty much across the board. From Bronze to GM, PC, Xbox, and PS4, he's at the bottom. It did rise slightly when he got a buff not too long ago, and when the Symmetra teleporter strategy started getting use, but after both of those, the pick rate very quickly fell back down. But is pick rate important? Does it really matter? Yes, absolutely it does, because players want to use strong, good characters that will help them win matches. They don't want to use bad or weak characters, and this is reflected in the pick rate of all the different heroes. If something is used all the time, it's because it's really good. If a hero is used almost never, like Bastion, it's because there's problems with the character. But there's another really big indicator that there's a serious issue with the character. Right now, we're in the middle of a bunker comp meta on the competitive ladder with Orisa and Roadhog, which is the single most optimal situation that Bastion could ever possibly have, and yet no one's using him. As it turns out, even in bunker comp, other DPS are still a better choice. Torbjorn, who has a very similar role to Bastion, is thriving in bunker comp, but Bastion isn't. This doesn't mean that Bastion is never useful, but if a character is viable only 10% of the time and a detriment to the team the other 90% of the time, that's not a good place for the character to be. I know some people hate Bastion, but I'm not one of them. As I said earlier, quite the opposite. I don't hate any of the heroes. In fact, I want every character in the game to be viable. Now let me clarify what I mean. I don't think every hero needs to be in the meta. I don't think a hero needs to be good on every map, or picked in all the matches. But every hero in the game should be viable in at least half of the matches that you play, and none of them should ever be viewed as a troll pick. No one should ever feel that their team is at a distinctive disadvantage simply because they have a particular hero on their team. And yet, that is precisely how a lot of players feel when they have a Bastion on their team. Truth is, some heroes are always going to have lower pick rates than others, and that's okay within reason. But when you look at Bastion, who is consistently at the bottom with less than 1%, that's a problem. On the development side of things, consider this. It takes Blizzard up to 9 months to design, create, program, and test a hero. If a character only shows up once in every 100 matches, then simply put, that was a massive waste of time and effort by Blizzard. So now you know why this is such an issue, let's take a closer look at what exactly the problems with Bastion are. The first thing I want to show you is a quote from Jeff Kaplan, where he's talking about problematic characters and Blizzard's change in design philosophy. Well, just speaking for myself here, but I imagined 1 to 2 tanks and 1 to 2 supports with more variants. I also expected more hero switching. Naively, I didn't expect maining and one-tricking to be so dominant. We imagined a world where players would be okay with Torbjorn on defense, but not playing him on attack. The maining one-trick mindset led us to having to rework those characters to fit with how the game eventually evolved to be played. I guess what I'm saying is we hope to be able to create more highly situational characters with the thought that players would switch in situations where those characters weren't as viable. But they discovered they couldn't do that, because people wanted to play Torbjorn and Bastion and Symmetra on attack. They didn't only want to use those heroes on defense. This is also kind of one of the reasons why they got rid of the whole defense role. They didn't want it to be confusing, they just put all the DPS in one category. The issue now is that while Torbjorn and Symmetra have had these changes that make them more flexible, particularly on attack, Bastion is still kind of in that old mindset. He's still in that old way of thinking where it's primarily only good on defense. Yes, you can use Bastion on payload maps with the pirate ship strategy, but using Bastion on attack for the most part doesn't really work. And even if it does end up working, you probably would have been much better off using almost any other DPS. Let's go through each of these problems. Number 1. Bastion is far too strong against lower ranked players and uncoordinated teams. In the lower brackets, a turret or sentry mode Bastion locked down behind a barrier can be quite difficult and incredibly frustrating, but in the upper bracket, it's much easier to deal with. This is why a flat buff to the turret or to the sentry mode can be problematic. Sure, it becomes more viable in the upper bracket, but far too powerful and too frustrating for that lower bracket. Number 2. The extreme lack of mobility, and Sentry form encouraging players to stay in one place because it's so much stronger than Recon mode. I think the Bastion situation is quite similar to what happened with Torbjorn. With the old version of Torbjorn, inexperienced players would often place the turret and then try to babysit it. They would spend more time trying to repair the turret than using their own attack on the enemy. On the other hand, experienced Torbjorn players would build the turret and then move around using their own attack on the enemies, collecting scrap and tossing armor when necessary. When Blizzard reworked Torbjorn, they changed the hero so that it wouldn't be so stationary, and the new version would encourage and incentivize the exact type of gameplay strategy that the more experienced Torbjorn players had already been using, i.e., leave the turret alone and move around and do some damage. With Bastion, it's quite similar. Inexperienced players have a tendency to sit in one spot in Sentry mode and rarely ever move. The more experienced players will go to a spot, deal some damage, and then relocate somewhere else. Rarely do they ever lock themselves down in one spot. Although, with the changes that were made not too long ago, even the higher skilled players are finding themselves sitting in one spot for probably a little longer than maybe they should have, simply because the change to the spread pattern encourages the player to stay in that sentry mode even more. Number 3, Bastion requires more support than other heroes. Every DPS is going to be more effective with a pocket healer, that goes without saying. But the amount of effectiveness that Bastion loses when that support isn't there is much greater than the loss that other DPS have. And also, the benefit that Bastion gets is much higher when it is there than other DPS will get. It's kind of like both ends of the extreme. Also, no other DPS in the game requires the rest of the team to be built around it to the same extent that Bastion requires. To be clear, it's not absolutely necessary for Bastion to have a barrier and a pocket healer every single time. You can still use the character without it, but as I said before, he's significantly less effective. The fourth major problem is the setup time required for Bastion to be effective on attack. Other DPS have attacks and abilities that allow them to quickly poke out from around a corner and use them, but Bastion simply cannot do this with Sentry mode. In many cases, you need to already be in Sentry mode before the enemy enters your line of sight. While this isn't a problem on defense, it's a much bigger issue and limitation on attack. Now we know what the problems are, let's talk potential solutions. I think it's best if I specifically state what the goals with this potential rework would be. First, keep the character intact. Bastion should still have the same feel as he does now. This means keeping the uniqueness of the character and the different transformation modes he has: Recon, Sentry, and Tank. Second, the character needs to be viable in more situations, including on the attacking team of maps that are not payload. Third, a lower setup time and less reliance on other heroes. The team should never need to be fully built around Bastion. And fourth, Bastion should not be excessively difficult for uncoordinated teams or players in the lower bracket. The solution for Torbjorn was to make the turret more disposable, allow him to move around more, and just more focus on the hero itself. I think a similar strategy would be very effective with Bastion as well. My solution might seem a bit crazy at first, but bear with me for a few minutes as I think it would go a long way to improving the situation with Bastion across all ranks. Previously, I've mentioned replacing the self-heal with a damaging ability, but I've changed my mind on this. I want Bastion to be more independent than he was previously, with less reliance on a barrier and a pocket healer, so getting rid of the self-heal would be counterproductive to that end. Also, replacing it with a damage ability feels like it would just kind of overlap with Soldier 76 a little too much, so to be clear, Bastion would need to keep the self-heal. I think a lot of the problems with the hero stem from the fact that the Sentry mode is a permanent toggle. This limits what Blizzard can do and how strong they can make it. It also encourages the bad strategy of sitting in one place and never moving. As it is now, Sentry mode is by far the preferred mode, and the game encourages the player to be in that mode as much as possible. And I think that needs to change. I have two different options to try to achieve that goal. Personally, I like the second option better, but I feel either of them would work quite well. Let's take a look at option 1. Option 1 would change Sentry mode from being a permanent toggle and make it into a normal ability similar to that of Hanzo's Storm Arrows and Torbjorn's Overload. Making it into an ability like this opens up all kinds of cool possibilities. Blizzard could speed up the transformation time, increase the rate of fire, buff the damage, tighten the spread, improve the ironclad, allow it to land critical hits, or because Bastion is supposed to be anti-tank, they could even add other cool features like bonus damage to barriers or armor. Transforming into Sentry mode would allow Bastion to have a huge impact for a short amount of time. Immediately with this change, dealing with an enemy Bastion is far less frustrating for an uncoordinated team or players in the lower bracket. But at the same time, transforming into Sentry mode would still allow Bastion to have a huge impact, but for a shorter amount of time. So that brings up the next question: how long should it last? Most abilities in this game last between 5 and 8 seconds. I think for something like this, maybe 6 seconds could work. However, I don't think this ability should have a normal cooldown for a couple of reasons. First, if you switch to Sentry mode, are you going to be locked into that for the full duration? Because that would be really frustrating for a Bastion player, particularly if suddenly something changes and you're now locked into that mode for the next 4 or 5 seconds. You don't want that. But if the ability is cancelled early, well, then you lose a lot of that value from using your ability, and that's not something that other characters ever really have to deal with. Hanzo never has to cancel Storm Arrows. Torbjorn never has to cancel Overload. So it doesn't feel right if the Bastion player loses a lot of that value by having to cancel Sentry mode and then getting a full duration cooldown as a result. Now, yes, some characters like Reaper can cancel their Wraith form early, but that's actually an advantageous thing and not a drawback like canceling Sentry mode would be. I think the simple and best thing to do would be to place Sentry mode on a fuel gauge, but there would be a slight catch to it. Unlike Defense Matrix or Moira's healing, there isn't much point into switching into Sentry mode for only 1 second or rapidly. You don't need to do that. For Sentry mode to be effective, you need to stay in it for several seconds at minimum. So to that end, I would make it so that you can only switch into Sentry mode when the fuel gauge is full, but you can then cancel it anytime you need to. The player can then choose to use it as much as they want, and if they need to switch back to Recon for whatever reason, they don't lose any of that value because the fuel is still in the meter. If they only use half of it, then it's going to take half as long for the meter to fill back up. This would give the Bastion player the freedom to switch into Sentry mode as often as they want and still be impactful, while also refunding any of that unused time. So there would be a slight cost to switching out of Sentry mode early. You have to wait until the meter's full before you can use it again, but canceling this feels a whole lot more like Reaper canceling Wraith form than a Hanzo having to cancel Storm Arrows. Changing it from the permanent toggle to this kind of ability would also encourage and incentivize the same general strategy that experienced Bastion players are already doing. Rather than sitting in one spot, a Bastion would be moving around far more often. As a result of this change, Recon mode can also be improved, and Sentry mode can be buffed without fear of making it too overpowered. The new version of Sentry mode would allow the player to make an intelligent, deliberate decision on when and where he wants to use the Sentry mode ability, and it's still going to be quite impactful in the fight, as opposed to what it is now, which is essentially, Sentry mode is so much better than Recon, I'm just going to stay in it for as long as I possibly can and try not to leave it. There is a possible problem with this change, being that Bastion would no longer have the long-term barrier busting potential that he has now, although I feel that 6 seconds of Sentry mode should be more than enough time to deal with an enemy barrier, and he would still be one of the best barrier busting characters in the game. Provided that isn't quite enough, Blizzard could always make the change where his Sentry mode deals some kind of additional damage to barriers, to offset not being in Sentry mode as a permanent toggle. And again, because it's a short duration ability, it's going to be a lot easier to balance than something that would be permanent. Now, for the ultimate for option 1, I would pretty much just leave it as is. There really wouldn't need to be much changes to the tank mode, at least for this option. Although I think maybe the animation when the tank mode is ending is too long. They could probably shorten that. I don't think he needs to be that vulnerable. Now that that is option 1, let's take a look at option number 2. I know this is kind of a running joke with character reworks where they take the ultimates and then they make them into a normal ability, but with Bastion, this sort of thing actually makes a lot of sense, specifically if we're trying to adhere to the rules and to the goals that I mentioned earlier, where we keep the Recon, Sentry, and Tank mode. So given that, just hear me out on this. No other character is fully locked into place for extended periods of time. Yes, characters like Orisa and Widowmaker might be mostly stationary, but they can still move around a bit. Yeah, Mei gets into the ice block, but she's completely invulnerable during that time. The only time characters are ever truly locked into one place is when they're using their ultimate, like Pharah, Junkrat, and Hanzo. It should also be noted that ultimates like those tend to be some of the most powerful in the game, and would fit quite well with Bastion in Sentry mode. So simply put, option 2 would swap Sentry and Tank mode. Sentry mode would become the ultimate, and Tank mode would become a normal ability. Now quite obviously, Tank mode would need to be rebalanced as a normal ability. I imagine it would function quite like Hanzo's Storm Arrow. You activate the ability, and then you get a certain number of attacks before it switches you back into normal mode. From just this change, Bastion would get a drastic increase in his mobility. Not from having any kind of a speed boost or a dash or any other thing like that, but simply for the fact that he is no longer forced to be stationary in order to deal effective damage. This change would make Bastion viable in nearly all situations on both attack and defend. Bastion would be far less frustrating for less coordinated teams to deal with, and would also have a lot less reliance on his own team for support. There are a few potential drawbacks with option 2. The first is kind of the same problem that we saw with option 1, where Bastion would now be worse as a barrier-busting character. Current Sentry mode is extremely good at destroying barriers, and if you don't have that as a normal ability, then Bastion's barrier-busting potential would go down quite a bit. But I feel that with the Tank mode, he would still have barrier-busting potential along the lines of Hanzo in terms of the damage to it. Now, that might be acceptable, and we can just leave it at that. Or, like with the other option, Blizzard could add extra damage to the Tank mode that only gets applied to barriers. So Bastion would still maintain the same barrier break potential he has now, without making the attack itself strong against the actual characters. This is, again, kind of like Torbjorn's ultimate, where it deals extra damage to armor, but doesn't change the damage to characters that don't have armor. The second concern is a little more difficult to deal with, because this option might feel a little too different from how Bastion currently plays. This is one of those things where it's going to be different for everyone. Personally, I think it would be way cooler to transform into a tank every 10 or 12 seconds, as opposed to switching into a stationary Sentry mode, but that's just me. You might agree with it, you might not. So this concern is kind of up to you. Alright, so let's talk about the ultimate. As I said earlier, Sentry mode would become the new ultimate, and because of that, it can become far more powerful than it is now. The strengths of this ult would be massive damage, barrier break, and a general area control of everything within line of sight. The ultimate has a couple of weaknesses. First, it has good counterplay, where just like a D.Va ultimate, if you know the Bastion's there, just hide behind a wall and wait until it goes away. The second weakness, and this is a major one, is what the Sentry mode already has, the fact that it's completely stationary. But unlike a normal Sentry mode, you cannot cancel the ultimate Sentry mode. In this way, it would function just like Pharah's ultimate. When you press the ultimate button, you now have the potential to do a massive amount of damage, but you are also committed to that ultimate for the full duration. The main reason why I like this option better is because the only time you're ever truly locked into a stationary position is during the ultimate, which is what other characters have, and I'm totally fine with that. Let's quick recap. With both of these options, the general idea is for Bastion to spend most of the time in Recon with frequent switches to either Sentry or Tank mode, where for a short amount of time, Bastion gets a nice damage boost. This would make the character much more viable in a majority of situations, while at the same time not making the hero too difficult or frustrating for the lower bracket players or uncoordinated teams to deal with. Let's look at that checklist. Do these changes make Bastion still feel like he does now? Option 1, yes, definitely. Option 2, maybe not quite as much, but again, that's more of a personal opinion as you still have the same modes, they're just reversed. Is the character going to be more viable, specifically when on the attacking team? Yes for both options. Does the character have less setup time? Again, yes for both options. And lastly, does this give Bastion the potential to have an impact without being frustrating to deal with? And yes for both. So there you have it. 2 potential options for a Bastion rework, and I think both of them would work quite well. Again, I like the second one a little bit better, but either one would be a vast improvement over where the character is right now. So which option would you prefer if you got the choice? Or would you like to see something entirely different? If that's the case, let me know what that is down below. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Also, come hang out in my Discord server and my Twitch live stream. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see what kind of cool VIP rewards you can get, check the links down below. And remember, always blame the controller, because it's never your fault.